thinking about culture should be in terms of looking at research that might involve an alien civilization. And one of my questions is basically, can we assume a mutually intelligible symbolic system for representing ideas and actions? And kind of lurking within this, from my perspective, is a question related to this idea that mathematics is one way that we would share something with an alien civilization, which, you know, obviously there's been a fair amount written on that idea, and I'm not so sure about that. I'm not going to really address that question directly today, but this sort of all goes around that question and deals with it in a kind of indirect way. And so I think certainly while we have similar, you know, obviously we would react to the same principles, how we symbolically represent those principles can be quite different. I'll come to that in a few minutes. Oh, now it's slowing down again. There we go. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the relationship between intelligence and culture. And I'm going to ask a question about how would culture be different if our sensory apparatus were different. I'm going to talk a little bit about differences in communication in relation to culture. And I'm going to ask, what is culture? This is one of the big questions. As I've read through a lot of the literature on SETI, this question doesn't get asked very often. This question doesn't get asked very often in a lot of places, whether we're talking about the public media or whether we're talking about social science research. We tend to assume that we know what culture is, and we don't problematize the nature of culture. And I'm going to talk a little bit about anthropology and the study or invention of culture. And then I'll talk about implications for SETI research. And there we go. Okay, so what is culture? As I said, we tend to assume that culture is a topic that's not really in need of explication. We use the term all the time, and we give relatively little thought to what it means. Culture has a tendency to become a homogenizing category. We talk about people who belong to a particular culture, and then lurking in that idea is that in some sense they think pretty much the same way. We don't unpack that and think about what it really means to talk about people in a particular culture. In anthropology, we refer to this as being essentialistic. We'll take certain characteristics, stereotypes of a group of people and represent those as being typical, being their culture, being the way that they do things. We do this for ourselves too. We don't just do this for other societies. If you think about how we represent, you know, Americans, often we represent ourselves and others represent us as being highly individualistic. And I always tell my students, well, you just go down to the football game at the University of Texas on Saturday and watch 90,000 people all wearing burnt orange and doing this, and you tell me how individualistic we really are. It's easy to pick up on these kinds of tendencies and say this is what a culture is, but what we're going to get to here is that, in fact, it really turns out to be very difficult. The standard definition of culture is a shared set of beliefs, customs, and ideas that are learned and that unify people into coherent and identifiable groups. Culture represents a form of collective or social memory that links past, present, and future. This is all fine. It's unfortunately a little bit simplistic, and this is what you'll see in any anthropology textbook. That's basically the kind of definition that you're going to come across. It tends to represent culture as being deterministic, that it's heavily shaping the way that we do things, and also it tends to create an idea of culture as bounded. There's Japanese culture, and there's Chinese culture, and there's Iraqi culture, and so on. The world isn't like that, as I'll come to in a few minutes. Okay. A better definition would be to say that people are not only held together, but may be divided by their customs and beliefs, even when they ostensibly belong to the same culture. Rather than a deterministic thing, culture is better understood as a process that people use to contest, to negotiate, to restructure, and to think about their environment, to think about what's going on collectively and individually. It's a way to characterize their surroundings. Now, The short of this is that culture is in a constant state of flux. It's moving. It's not a bounded thing. It's actually a moving target. This makes it miserably difficult as an anthropologist to study it because it won't stop for you. And once you characterize it as being X, you discover that in fact it's X plus Y and 80,000 other things, and you find yourself in trouble. My definition is a little different. I believe that culture is a complex arrangement of symbolic structures that are negotiated and developed in reaction to personal experience mediated by particular sensory apparatuses, and through which individuals organize and interpret sensory data that are in turn used for further organization, interpretation, and creation of symbolic structures. This is a circle, okay? What's going on is a constant feedback system in which the things that we generate shape what we then generate next. All right? We all know this is going on, but we often don't think a lot about this when we talk about culture. The arrangements are interconnected areas of memory, and they're used to translate concrete experience into domains of abstract reasoning, into domains of subjective reasoning and feeling. And that's what we do with culture. Culture is really something, rather than something that's a thing that's out there, it's something we do. It's an action, and it's a process. And that's how I think about culture. It's intimately tied to biology, and as we get further into the talk today, you'll see why this is very important from my perspective. People don't just observe what's going on around them. Culture shapes the way the brain forms. And if you think about this for a minute, there have been studies of people, who have been deprived of sensory input, like a child locked up in a room for 15 years or something like that. They have a great deal of difficulty learning to talk, learning to interact with other human beings. And there's an anthropologist I think he's at MIT named Bruce Wexler, who's talked about the idea that in fact culture influences the way the pathways in the brain are formed. Now, that in and of itself is quite interesting because what it means indirectly is that if you're from a different cultural context, you're biologically a little different from the people. Let's say you grow up in California. Well, we know Californians are different from people from Massachusetts, right? Certainly there's something different going on in the brain between an English speaker and a Japanese speaker, because the mode of symbolic representation in Japanese, as I will talk about in a minute, is entirely different from the way it works in English. And actually, the language really works in a way entirely different from English. Intelligence in individuals, and I think more broadly across species, needs to be thought about in terms of developing within some kind of social context. It isn't something that's just innate. It's something that develops in relation to your encounter with your environment. Now, that raises the next question: what is intelligence? And I went back and looked at the thing by Marvin Minsky about this, and he argued that these are some of the basic characteristics that you would expect from an intelligent being: problem solving, analytical skills, ability to describe the world, explanatory skills, accumulation and exchange of information, allocation of scarce resources, planning ahead, and self-awareness. I think this is all good, but it's not enough, because it really doesn't address the issue of culture sufficiently. It's suggestive that culture is involved, but he doesn't go into really thinking a great deal about what's going on with culture. And in this is really a question about what makes us different from other animals on this planet. What makes us different from chimpanzees? We share, 99% of the same genetic material with chimpanzees? Obviously, we don't share the same behavioral patterns with them. We're a very, very different creature. An important question is, why is that the case? What is it about us that makes us so different? And the answer, I guess predictably as an anthropologist, that I'm going to come up with is that it's culture that makes us different. Michael Tomasella, who's an anthropologist at the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig, believes that the aspect of humans that really differentiates them from other beings, other primates and other mammals in general, is that we have this enormous capacity to deeply empathize with other people. Now, you know, obviously, and I'll get to this in a minute, it's really hard to look at a dog and know for sure if the dog understands what I'm doing, because we can't get into the dog's head. But one of the things that we do as humans is that we assume that we can get into each other's heads. This really makes us different from other animals. Tomasello thinks that this is a small difference. This accounts for the very minor genetic difference between ourselves and, say, chimpanzees. This is a small difference that leads to a cascading effect through the processes that humans use to do cultural things. It takes off once this happens. Once a being is able to empathize, it's able to say, wow, you're a thinking being just like I am. We share that. Once that happens, from his perspective, the whole culture thing just takes off. And I think he's right about this. It generates the ability to internalize and elaborate on collaborative production. We do things together because we recognize the fact is that all of us in this room are operating in the same way intellectually. Something's going on there that we share and we can talk about in common. And so it allows us to create and accumulate cultural artifacts, practices, and beliefs. I think that's the basis of intelligence. That's where intelligence really comes from. The empathetic ability generates the capacity to understand others as intentional mental beings. As far as we know, we're the only creatures on this planet that do that. We think about other ones around us, other humans, as being intentional and being mental, that we think about what we're doing. The evolution of this capacity enabled new forms of cultural learning and the accumulation of artifacts and ideas that, of course, are modified over time. Again, you have to think in terms of a kind of feedback loop where these things are constantly changing. Human children grow up surrounded by socially and historically constructed artifacts and practices. Because we're immersed in this milieu, we wind up doing a variety of things. We can benefit from the accumulated knowledge and skills that's come before us. We acquire and we use perspective-based cognitive representations, symbols, as well as analogies and metaphors constructed from symbols. We internalize specific kinds of discourses and interactions that are developed into skills that allow us to regulate cognitive processes through self-awareness of those processes, metacognition. In other words, we aren't simply in a situation where we have mental processes. We can think about the fact that we have mental processes and contemplate what's going on with that. We symbolically represent and describe the world around us, and we think and we create dialogically. In other words, we interact with each other and create dialogues as a way to represent and construct our reality. Now, this is the key point here, and this is the point I think that's really important for where I'm going to go talking today. Our entire understanding of the world is mediated through these processes. And these are mediated through our sensory apparatuses. So the gist of this is that culture is at the basis of everything. Now, anyone ever read anything by the philosopher Thomas Nagel? It's this wonderful paper he wrote, 30, 40 years ago, something like that, which asks a simple question: what is it like to be a bat? Now, this may seem like a funny question at first, but it's a really profound question because bats aren't like us. He argues that consciousness of experience occurs at a variety of different levels among animal lives. And we can imagine what it is to be a bat, but we can't know what it is to be a bat. It's impossible for us to know what it means to be a bat. Now, by extension, you can make the argument that I actually don't know what it is to be any of you, and you don't know what it is to be me, and we can't do that. We really can't get into each other's heads. But it's a lot easier for us to feel as though we know what it is to be another person, to empathize with another person, than it is with a bat. From Nagel's perspective, understanding what it is to experience being another form of life, animal life, is impossible. We can't empathize with bats. Why can't we empathize with bats? Come on. Because they echolocate. They sense and process the world in a way completely different from the way that we do. They use echolocation to discriminate among objects, and echolocation mediates the way in which bats deal with the capacities. If we talk about what Minsky was pointing to, the various capacities that he says an intelligent being should have, and bats don't have all those capacities, but they have some of them, like planning ahead to avoid running into things or identifying mosquitoes to eat. If you think about this, whatever's going on in their heads needs to be really different from what goes on in our heads, because it's not primarily visually based. So their model of the world is based upon interpretation of sound reflections as opposed to light reflections. That means their model's really different. Humans don't vary a whole lot biologically. We're very similar in that, we all have the same basic components. We're really different from bats. Bats put things together in a way that we don't. But even among humans, and I thought about this last week, I was at a conference at Yale on concepts of insanity in Japan. And there was a woman sitting in the front, and she was deaf. And so they had a translator to do signing to her. And I was more intrigued by the translator than the conference, because I started watching the translator, and I realized, he's making very overt motions with his mouth, and he's moving his hands. The hand movements, from my perspective, don't seem to match the words very well. And I realized that I have absolutely no idea what's going on there. I can see the mouth movements and hook them up to words, but then if this girl has been deaf her whole life, she can't hook them up to sounds like I can. So what model is she making in her head of the language activity that's going on there? It's got to be really different from mine. Her interpretation, she understands what's going on, but her interpretation of the symbolic things that are passing, it's going to form a model that's not like my model. And I can't imagine really what that model is, and I certainly can't know it. I can't empathize with it. The same thing could be said for someone who's blind, who doesn't put the world together through vision, but they have to put it together in another way. And so even among humans, we have some pretty significant walls when it comes to empathizing with people as they have different kinds of sensory apparatuses, or a different grouping of them in which one of them is primary and another one isn't. The things that we choose to focus on when we construct the world around us vary dramatically from one culture to another. Just as, in a sort of more extreme sense, someone who's deaf or blind has to construct the world in a very different way from people who have hearing and have sight. So, I'm going to give you an example of how people in Japan construct the world quite differently from the way that we do, and it comes from counting. Now, counting seems like the most rudimentary of things, right? You got 2 pencils and 3 cars, and that's easy. But you can actually symbolically represent the information very differently from the way that we do in English. This is how you count something that's flat, like a sheet of paper or a CD. It reads ichimai, nimai, sammai, 1 flat, thin thing, 2 flat thin things, or 3 flat things. This is how you count a book. Isatsu, nisatsu, sansatsu. That refers to a thicker flat thing, or a volume. This is how you count a small animal. Ippiki, nihiki, sanbiki. This is a counter for small animals. There's a different one for large animals. So you wouldn't count a cow the same way that you would count a mouse. This is for counting machines, like washing machines and cars. This is ichidai, nidai, sandai, reading across this way. And this would be for a cylindrical object, like a pen or a pipe. Ippon, nihon, sanbon. There are counters for so many different things in Japanese that it drives the poor English speaker trying to learn this rotten language crazy, just trying to count. Counting is really hard for English speakers in Japanese, because it's very hard for us to conceptually get a hold of the idea that we differentiate objects in the world on the basis of shape rather than on plurality and singularity as we do in the United States. So English and Japanese do different things when it comes to counting. And I threw this up here also to point out that you can write Japanese vertically as well as horizontally, which makes things further more confusing. And in fact, when you write things vertically in Japanese, you read from right to left, and when you write things horizontally, you read from left to right. I don't think anybody could sit down and make a language more difficult and annoying than Japanese. Although speaking, it's really not that bad, because they only have 5 vowel sounds, which is kind of nice. We have like 14 in English. Japanese distinguishes among shapes and sizes. It does not distinguish between plural and singular. When you talk about things in Japanese, like chairs, you have 1 chair, 2 chair, 3 chair. Think about what is the function of putting an S at an end of the word to indicate that you have more than 1 as opposed to 1. Who cares? You don't need to do that to count, right? It's irrelevant. And yet we do that in English. We don't even think about that. So we have an interesting thing when we try to translate. There's an information loss that goes on. We translate counting between Japanese and English. This here says enpitsu ippon, which means 1 cylindrical object that is a lead writing brush. That's the literal translation. In English, 1 pencil. Now, the word pencil indexes the fact that it's a cylindrical object that you use to write. Okay? So that meaning is not entirely missing from the word pencil. But in fact, we don't privilege that meaning. That's a very secondary thing. It's implied. This is kuruma nidai, which means 2 cars that are large machines. This character means car. This is 2, and this is the counter for large machines. We translate as 2 cars. The basic interpretive and classificatory information associated with how Japanese people perceive what is important in counting things is lost when you translate it into English. There's something missing. And in fact, some of what's important to English speakers, plurality and singularity, is added. When you translate it into English, we differentiate between 1 and many. You don't do that in Japanese because it's not important in Japanese. They don't care about that. That is only one example of differences between what's seen as important to be explicit about and what's important to imply. When Japanese people speak, they generally do not use personal pronouns. So instead of saying, I drive my car, they say, drive car. And you know what that means if you're Japanese. Instead of saying, you drive your car, they say, drive car. Instead of saying, they drive their car, they say, drive car. The only time they will use personal pronouns is when it's absolutely necessary to do so. If the context doesn't tell you what's going on, then you throw in a personal pronoun to clarify that. But you often, when speaking about yourself, don't use personal pronouns at all. Some anthropologists have suggested that this points to a very different way of thinking about self among Japanese, that they downplay the individual self in favor of social context. I think there's a lot of truth to that. Japanese do that. Although they recognize that they're individual selves. The language points to, again, an idea that they are constructing the world in a way that's different from the way that English speakers construct it. And if you think about how important personal pronouns are for us, what do when a sentence doesn't need a personal pronoun? You throw in the word it. What function does it do? Why do you have to say it is a car instead of just say car? We'd all know what you mean if you point and say car. In Japanese, you just say car. In fact, actually in Japanese, instead of that, you say kuruma desu, which means car politely. And if you want to be not so polite, you just say car. So again, they're emphasizing a whole different set of things that matter. So how would a bat count? If you think about this for a minute, how would we translate counting between humans and a race of intelligent beings who process data through echolocation? Would counting, or perhaps more generally mathematics, necessarily be symbolically represented the way that humans do this? I don't think it necessarily would. Maybe such beings would be interested in shape and size or reflectivity of objects when they count. So they might count like one large sound absorbent thing, two large sound absorbent thing, or one small shiny thing. And shiny in that case would mean something different from shiny from a visually based group of beings. It might mean something that's reflective of sound, an entirely different way of seeing the world. So the underlying principles of symbolic systems like mathematics or music should be understood by humans and aliens. I think the principles would be understood. The way in which that we obtain and process sensory data will influence the way in which we construct the systems that we use to describe those principles. The elements of the world that are deemed important in a particular culture will influence cognition. Go back to what I was talking about earlier, that culture itself is shaped out of the processes through which that we process the world. And we wind up with different ways to classify the things around us. That's part of what culture is. It's a system for classifying things. And we will wind up with different ways of emphasizing what's more important or less important. I think the nature of empathy, I think if you're going to be an intelligent being, you have to be able to empathize with others and recognize them as intelligent beings. But the nature of empathy will be strongly influenced by the manner in which a being processes information and then collectively represents that information symbolically and transfers it to those that come after a particular group. So here are some implications. Culture is not distinct from biology. The sensory apparatus individuals use significantly shapes the experience of the world and the manner in which they experience and construct cultural ideas and patterns of behavior. Culture represents a context for linking memory, experience, and predictability into an interpretive framework that people use to deal with their surroundings. Now, another interesting thing about Japanese, when you talk about predictability in the future, the Japanese language does not use a future tense. It's present and past only. Present tense refers to both things now and things that can come in the future. Culture is not bounded, it is not constant, and it is always in a state of change. And culture is not consistent. It's an amalgam of individual experiences and interpretations and memories that tend to be treated as though they're consistent, but in fact involve a great deal of idiosyncrasies at the individual level. And then my key point, culture mediates all human interactions with the world. This is whether you want to talk about physics, mathematics, music, painting, whatever it is, the way that we come across the world is mediated by culture, and therefore it influences all aspects of our thinking. All right. So culture shapes the way we construct symbolic systems for representing the world. Mathematics is one of those systems. Now, I want to turn a little bit and talk about anthropology in this. Having established what culture is from my perspective and what it does, I want to actually talk about the remarkable way in which anthropologists can mess up when they're trying to study other cultures. And this comes from my background as an anthropologist who studies Japan. So I'm going to ask about the practical implications of thinking about culture intelligence this way. And I think the interesting thing about anthropology is it provides a nice analogy for SETI research. Anthropologists are the original scientists who studied aliens. All right? We're the first ones to do that. I know you all think you guys are the first ones to do that, but actually anthropologists are the first ones to do that. Because when Europeans went out in the world, they thought everyone else was really weird and alien. And they were trying to learn about alien cultures. Now, she looks pretty alien, right? She doesn't to us anymore. But imagine yourself in like 1841, stepping off the boat from, America and seeing that. That would look pretty alien. Early anthropologists were often known as armchair anthropologists, and this is where I think one of the real interesting analogs is with what you folks are doing now. They had to do research at a tremendous distance. There were long time delays, and there were very unreliable modes of communication. Now, the distances obviously aren't the same as talking about interstellar distances, but I suppose from the perspective of someone in the early 19th or mid-19th century, it may have seemed like that. This guy here is Edward Burnett Tyler, and he's probably the father of modern social anthropology. He was an Englishman. They tended not to go out to the place that they were studying, but instead they sat back in their office in England and they sent letters out all over the place. And so they wound up with information, data that came back that was mediated by people like missionaries, colonial officials, and military personnel. Now we can imagine how objective they would be, right? And they constructed pretty complicated theories about human behavior based upon what they got. When the data were received, they were interpreted largely based upon theoretical frameworks and assumptions that had a very strongly Western tinge to them. This is a kinship diagram for Iroquoian people from the native northeast of the United States. And a guy named Lewis Henry Morgan, who's really the father of the study of kinship, looked at what they did and thought they were really weird, because if you look over here, you're talking about this person. His father's brother is father and his mother's sister is mother. And in fact, the social relationships between what we would call aunts and uncles are the same as for their biological parents. And so Morgan thought this was very strange because it seemed to set up kinship along non-biological lines. And in fact, what this got interpreted as is an example of a primitive form of kinship. Now, we know today that that's not the case. It's simply a different form of thinking about kinship. But from 19th century anthropologist perspectives, the idea was that they used social Darwinism basically as a framework for thinking about evolutionary processes in terms of culture. And guess what's at the top of the whole heap? Europeans, right? They're the ones who are the most evolved.
Did Morgan actually visit aliens?
Yes. He's actually one of the first ones to go and do what we would think of as ethnographic field work today.
He wasn't an Englishman, he was an American.
He was an American, yep. And he went and he did. And he really, for his time, he did a remarkable study. So armchair anthropology kind of came to an end in the early 20th century as transportation improved. And circumstances related to the Second World War led to another incident of this, a very important incident of this. And this is Ruth Benedict. How many of you are familiar with her work? She wrote a very famous book called The Chrysanthemum and the Sword. She was trained by a guy named Franz Boas, who was the founder of the first anthropology department in the United States at Columbia and was actually trained as a physicist in Germany, which is kind of interesting. She worked on the Hopi up until World War II, but then she was commissioned by the U.S. government to do a study of the Japanese and Japanese culture in the 1940s because the Japanese didn't make any sense at all to the Americans. Things like flying planes into the side of ships and killing yourself were really hard for us to understand. So they decided since we were going to win the war, we needed to have some study done. And she went and did it, even though she didn't know the Japanese language, which is kind of interesting. Now, this presents a real problem, right? You know, you're an anthropologist and it's 1944. You can't just hop over to Japan and say, hey, I'm here to study your culture so we can beat you. That wouldn't work, right? So she had to do something else. What she did was she looked at translated literature and films, and she looked at Japanese Americans who were interned in prisoner camps in the desert in the Southwest. This has a lot of problems, obviously, because she wasn't looking at Japanese. The respondents were passive, and they were speaking with a representative of the government that had imprisoned them, so they weren't real comfortable talking with her anyway. What's really interesting about Benedict's work is that this book became the cornerstone of all studies of Japan following World War II. It is the most important, the most cited book in the history of the study of Japan. It's sold widely in the U.S. and in Japan. The Japanese read it in translation. And there's 1946. And there is no book that has had more influence on our understanding of Japan than Benedict's book. When the book came out, if you go read the scholarly reviews, they liked it. The most important contemporary book yet written on Japan here for the first time is a serious attempt to explain why the Japanese behave the way they do. And then this from a guy named John Embrey, who had done the first ethnographic study of Japan of any kind in the 1930s. Dr. Benedict, with the soft words of a fox spirit, leads the reader into the forest of Japan, and before he knows it, she has him bewitched into believing that he understands and is familiar with every root and branch of Japanese culture, except for one thing. She didn't study Japan. She studied Japanese Americans, many of whom didn't even speak Japanese. And that's one of the big problems. Although her work was extremely important, it was taken as being representative of Japan. And much of the work after cited her work right up into the 1980s. And in fact, if you go and study cross-cultural communication, you will still see this book regularly cited when people talk about how weird and different the Japanese are. So Benedict did an armchair anthropology job that was central to the creation of what we think of as Japanese culture. It was also very important as a handbook for understanding Japan by the U.S. government during the occupation, when we engaged in a process of social engineering for Japan, which obviously was successful. The problem with her work is that there was a lack of valid empirical data that led to an emphasis of theory over description and analysis, which is a big problem in anthropology if you do that. Benedict basically fit Japanese culture into a theoretical framework that she had developed earlier in her work on the Hopi. This led to a tendency...
Did you say it was obviously successful or obviously unsuccessful?
The social engineering was quite successful in Japan, which is sort of an aside, but I mean, obviously they turned into a fairly successful economy and democratic society. So despite this, the occupation went pretty well, but you have to give a lot of credit to the Japanese on that, of course. This led to a tendency to create stereotypes of Japanese culture and to think in simplistic terms about how Japanese behave. Groupism, hyper-loyalty, the samurai ethic, these are the kinds of stereotypes that have been used in reference to Japan for a long time. All of them have a kernel of truth, but there are also big problems in representing the society that way as a whole. What became understood as Japanese culture was simply not an accurate representation, and yet it was the thing that gets used most of the time, until pretty recently. So we have a situation in which Japan was invented. There was a complex interplay of assumptions and theory and data and misinterpretations that became what we thought of as this alien culture. This is what Japan became for Americans. So our understanding of Japanese behavior was filtered through our own cultural notions. An assumption that objective data collection and analysis of alien cultures is possible, an assumption of racial homogeneity, and an assumption of uniformity of behavior based upon cultural determinism. These are the things that underlie what Benedict did. Okay, what are the implications in terms of this and thinking about culture and contact? When I've read through a variety of things related to SETI research, I've noticed that people ask questions such as, would E.T. be altruistic? Would he be bent on imperial domination? These questions point to assumptions that tend to influence the kinds of answers that we arrive at. One of the assumptions is that aliens will think in uniform ways and have a uniform culture. They will act in consistent and predictable ways and will display cultural consensus. Reflection on our own case here and the above discussion makes it pretty clear that if they're anything like us, they're not going to do that. There is also a tacit assumption that in much of the literature dealing with contact, that the idea that an alien civilization will be culturally unified, which is unlike our own civilization. Also, we will discover the alien civilization that we encounter rather than inventing it in ways that are consistent with our own culturally shaped frameworks for understanding others. And at some root level, we will be able to empathize with an alien intelligence. These are very common assumptions. I think they're assumptions many people have about this kind of encounter, and certainly assumptions they have with any alien culture here on Earth. There's a lot of these work from an evolutionary model of thinking about culture. Progress leads to greater levels of unified organizational structure, which implies higher level of civilization that is relatively homogeneous. Animism versus monotheism discredits this completely. Japan is one of the most technologically and socially advanced nations in the world. There's long been an idea that monotheism typically goes with increased social organization. This is something that goes back to social Darwinism. But Japan is also animistic. Their religious beliefs are entirely animistic. There's an assumption of human and particularly Western perspectives that have a teleological notion of cultural evolution in which there is a very broad, a very universal outcome to the processes of cultural change, that the more advanced you become, the more alike you will be. Advanced in this formulation becomes inexorably associated with culturally and politically unified. Now, if we think about increased technological sophistication on Earth, we do not see necessarily an association with increase in political or social sophistication. The United States is a wonderful example of this. Intelligence is uniform. This is another assumption. It is uniform and a product of evolutionary change and is biological, not cultural. Thus, it should be displayed in highly similar ways among different intelligent species. The problems with these anthropocentric perspectives is that we tend to assume an underlying likeness with humanity. In any intelligent being, in the ways in which culture is going to be expressed with some kind of civilization that's intelligent. Culture will exist among aliens. I think that if there are aliens out there, they will have culture, because I think that's the thing that leads to intelligence. It's the capacity to do culture. But I don't think that the nature of culture will be the same. And what that means is, of course, that with a different social environment, different sensory apparatuses, we may wind up with very different way in which intelligence is expressed among a different kind of civilization. They might be like us, but I don't think they will be. So what kind of implications do we have? One of the things I think is that we should be not only concerned if we do ever get a message of some sort that we find with deciphering meaning, but also to think about what the message sent tells us about the thing that sent it. The signal conveys both explicit and implicit information about the sender. If you think about the things that we send out into space all the time from our television, it tells us how dumb we can be, but it also would tell somebody else that we tend to, if they could figure out how to decipher it, that we're very visual. That would be one thing that it would tell them right away. And so I think that if we recognize that, we'll have a basis for creating some kind of message that might be understandable. That's at least one possibility. If you think about some of the, the very limited attempts that have been sent out to try to, see if somebody might catch up with us, the attempts, I think, have been to try to put out something that any technology ought to be able to make sense of. But there's another problem here. If you think about the message that was sent out by Professor Drake, it tells us information about our knowledge, including numbers from 1 to 10, DNA structure, and so on. But it actually requires a prior understanding of our culture, because the symbolic structures that are used to represent the information are embedded in our culture and are a product of our sensory experience of the world. They're a representation of really how we see things. Now, I remember reading about this, and that when Professor Drake showed this to some other scientists, they didn't automatically understand what was being represented. I've actually showed this to some students in class on occasion, and they'll get a few of them, but then they won't get a few of them. So even among really bright people, there are going to be some differences in how they respond. I think instead of being primarily concerned with the content of the message, we also want to think about what the message tells us about who sent it. There are several subtexts in the message sent by Professor Drake that convey information about us that are not necessarily part of the intended meaning. We think in terms of binary relationships. We encode information in terms of ones and zeros, and we understand two-dimensional images. We're very visual. We are highly logical. It's a very logical construction. Now, If you pick that up out of that message and think, wow, these are really logical people, you didn't understand us very well, because we're not very logical people. In fact, what the message tells us a lot about very logical scientists. It doesn't really tell an alien a whole lot about humanity. And I think that's something, there's a certain culture about what information matters that's encoded in the way scientists think about the world. And that's what gets presented here. Okay, I'm almost done. So I think for the future, we might think about interstellar message construction as involving not only thinking about the explicit message intended, but also considering the implicit message that is being conveyed along with the explicit message. Rather than asking the questions, what does ET mean in a message, or what information do we want to convey in a message from us to ET, we also need to be asking, what are the implicit indications and forms of information about ET and ourselves that are contained in any message sent or received? How are our signals products of culturally specific symbolic systems? How do they represent the way that we put the world together? And then how is someone who might bump across it going to be able to interpret that? How is information about our culture and our biology encoded in the messages that we generate? And again, in the reverse, how is that encoded in something we might receive? So what cultural assumptions go into the creation and interpretation of any message we create or receive? That's really the underlying point of my talk, is that that's something that we need to give a lot of thought to when we think about constructing messages that someone out there might get, or when we think about what we might interpret. Because we are inherently cultural beings, culture has and will continue to shape the process of looking for, and if contact is made, interpreting an encounter. We need to be overtly aware of this, and we need to attempt to bracket our own culturally circumscribed tendencies and assumptions as we try to think about this context of encountering another. And so that's basically what I have to say, and I'll open it up for questions. Thank you. Yes?
And let me come around with this microphone. It does not amplify, but it'll record what you're saying so that we can get it on video.
Could you compare and contrast the nature of empathy between, say, human beings and dolphins or whales, which in the popular culture are thought to be kind of like us?
I wish I could. I don't know enough about dolphins and whales to say anything that would really be intelligent. So it would be very, I guess, impressionistic from the popular culture perspective. My sense in the things that I've read and seen is that they do seem to empathize. They certainly communicate with each other. But I think you run into the same kind of problem as you do with bats. They echolocate, and so they put the world together in a very different way. So even if we take the assumption that they do empathize with each other, it might mean something very different. It might be put together in a very different way for them. And maybe that's part of the reason they seem intelligent, but we don't seem to be able to communicate with them. I don't know. But that's a guess. So it's a great question, by the way. I just don't have a great answer.
I have an answer. I have an answer for that.
Oh, good. Someone has an answer.
No, if you know Ron Reisman over at NASA Ames, talk to him. He worked for John Lilly for 9 years with the Dolphin Research Center. Ron Reisman. Yeah, he can help you out with that. I visited the DRC as a reviewer for the National Science Foundation as well too. So that's independent of my question. I'm aware certainly of Benedict. Are you aware? You're aware at the beginning of World War II, Joe Roquefort and the work he did decoding communications. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's a large part certainly. I'm surprised actually you didn't mention SETI in the context of David Kahn's Codebreakers book in 1968, because I think it was the last chapter. I mean, there's a lot of people who certainly think that you really can eliminate a lot of the social context because of the commonality, largely in I think the physics and the chemistry that goes along with underlying biology, as an example. And so I think that extends to the Roquefort analogy. Roquefort didn't know Japanese, yet he could direct naval forces in the Pacific to, deal with attacks in advance, planned attacks, and the like. And it gets to the ones and zeros. And the question is, if you're going to have some sort of mechanism of communication, other than communicating ones and zeros over long distances, do you have such a mechanism?
Well, I think the first thing I would say is that humans are basically pretty much the same. So we should be able to understand Japanese pretty effectively, and yet we still get it really wrong. I mean, I think that's part of the interesting thing, is that when you look around at humans, biologically there's not much variation. We're all the same. And yet culturally we can be different enough that Ruth Benedict, for example, I mean, there are some problems. Part of my point there is that part of the problem is the way she did her research, and that she dealt with some very similar kinds of issues that people doing SETI research are dealing with, where there are these great distances and time lags and that kind of thing. But the other point that I wanted to get at there is that she got it sort of kind of right and sort of kind of wrong. There are things about her work that's not off, but what happened as a result of that was the creation of an idea of what Japanese culture would be that only sort of reflects what in fact really goes on for Japanese. And it goes back to my earlier point about essentialism. And we got this clear, nice, concise, easy picture of what a Japanese person is and what a Japanese mind is. And ultimately, as that developed, we got in the 80s books like, my favorite one is a book called The Japanese Mind, which kind of works from the assumption that they've only got one, and all of them work the same way, which just isn't possible. We know that's not possible, but that becomes how we tend to construct other cultures. So one concern is that if we draw on our own way of thinking about what an intelligent being is, what civilization is, we will tend to frame that in terms of things that we take as normal, rather than necessarily getting at what's really going on. This is exacerbated when you get into an issue of dealing with an extraterrestrial, because they may be biologically different. They may not share that. They may not share the sensory apparatus that we have, and so they may put together culture, intelligence, and all these things symbolically quite differently. And again, the point is that underlying, we may have the same principles going on, but the symbolic framework that you create to represent those are dependent upon things that could be so different that they may not be mutually intelligible. The Japanese basis is the same as the American basis. They're the same bodies, the same eyes, and so on. The difference is that, in fact, they come up with a different symbolic apparatus, but we can translate that one pretty well. What happens if the biology is different? That's the point I'm trying to